Something is already happening. Not in a way you'd notice, not in a way that announces itself. There's no signal, no interior bell, no moment where you think, I am now evaluating this person. It just happens, quietly, underneath everything else, in the time it takes light to cross the room and reach you. Welcome to the Sleepy Biologist. And if you're here, you've probably spent the day surrounded by faces, strangers, colleagues, people you passed in a corridor and never thought about again. What I find quietly unsettling in the best possible way is how much your brain was doing during all of that. Without telling you, without asking. This channel keeps going because of the people who support it, the members, the ones who hit super thanks, the ones who've been here long enough to notice when the pacing changes. I notice too. And to anyone who leaves a comment at 2 a.m, I read those. They matter more than you'd think. There's a structure buried in the underside of your temporal lobe, tucked beneath the cortex. Unremarkable in size, bilateral, meaning you have one on each side. It's called the amygdala. You've probably heard the name, but hearing the name doesn't quite prepare you for what it actually does, which is respond to a face before the rest of your brain has finished processing how there is a face. That's not a metaphor. That's the circuit. The visual signal from your eyes travels in 2 directions simultaneously. One path is slow, deliberate, detailed, running through the visual cortex where shape and color and context get assembled into something you can recognize. The other path is short, crude. It skips most of the detail and goes directly to the amygdala, arriving in roughly 12 milliseconds. The amygdala receives something closer to a sketch than a photograph. Enough edges, enough contrast, enough of the geometry of a face to begin responding before the rest of your brain has caught up. You've already reacted. The thinking comes after. There's something almost uncomfortable about that if you sit with it. The idea that your first response to another person isn't yours in the way you imagine. It doesn't come from consideration or memory or anything you'd call a conscious process. It surfaces from tissue that was doing this long before consciousness had much say in anything. And yet it feels like you. It feels like instinct, like a gut sense, like something you trust. That gap between what the brain does and what the mind believes it did is what this whole episode lives inside. The amygdala is not exclusively a fear structure, though that's how it often gets described. It's more accurate to call it a relevance detector. Its job, stripped to its plainest function, is to flag things that matter, and for a social animal, faces matter enormously. Whether they signal threat or safety, familiarity or strangeness, calm or tension, these are not trivial distinctions. They were, for most of our evolutionary history, the kind of distinctions that determined whether you survived the next few minutes. It's worth pausing there, not to be dramatic about it, just to notice that the tissue responding to the face of a stranger on the subway is the same tissue that was responding to the same social signals hundreds of thousands of years ago, in bodies that look different, in environments that no longer exist, under conditions you will never experience. The amygdala doesn't know the difference. It responds to the geometry of threat with the same architecture it always has. What the research shows, and this is where it gets strange, is that the amygdala responds to faces even when the faces are presented subliminally, shown too briefly for conscious awareness. In studies using backward masking, where a neutral image immediately follows a fearful face so that the participant reports seeing nothing emotionally significant, the amygdala activates anyway. The response happens without the person having any experience of it. You can react to something you genuinely did not see. It's not entirely clear what that means for how we understand our own judgments. There's something in it that resists a tidy conclusion. Some part of your social world is being processed in a place you don't have access to. in a time frame shorter than a blink, using information your conscious mind never received. There's a dip sometimes when you hear something like this, a small deflation, because if the reaction is already happening beneath awareness, if the amygdala has already filed its report before you arrive at the scene, then what exactly is the conscious mind doing when it forms an opinion about someone? Part of the answer is catching up, constructing a reason for something that's already occurred. The brain is unusually good at this. It will produce a justification for a response it didn't choose, and the justification will feel, from the inside, exactly like the cause. You probably already know this feeling, even if you've never framed it that way. You've met someone and felt immediately uneasy, and then spent the next hour slowly accumulating reasons why, without ever questioning whether the unease came first. The temporal lobe sits roughly above and behind your ear. Run your finger along the side of your head, above the jaw, and you're somewhere near the neighbourhood of it. Inside, organised into sheets of interconnected cells, is a region called the superior temporal sulcus, a groove in the cortex that responds specifically to biological motion, the movement of eyes, the direction of a gaze, the turn of a head. This region communicates with the amygdala. They are part of a circuit, and the circuit runs fast. What it means is that you are not just reacting to a static face, you're reacting to the way the face moves, to the flicker of the eyes, the micro-tension in the jaw, the slight delay in a smile. All of that is being processed before you've decided to pay attention. The body is already attending, quietly, without making a fuss about it. There's something almost restful in that if you let it settle. The vigilance is not yours to carry consciously. You don't have to work at reading a room. Something older than your intentions is already doing it, has been doing it your whole life, runs the calculation with a kind of biological fluency that no deliberate effort could replicate. You're not responsible for the first half second. What comes after, the holding, the revising, the choosing what to do with what the amygdala handed you, that's where the rest of the story lives. But that's later. That's other chapters. For now, a face passed through your field of vision today. Dozens of them. Each one registered somewhere before you knew you were looking. The tissue responded. The signal moved. And by the time you were aware of having seen anyone at all, something in the brain had already begun to form a quiet opinion. You didn't decide to. The machinery was simply already on. The signal doesn't stop when the face disappears. Somewhere in the circuitry, a faint trace of it lingers, not quite memory, not quite sensation, just a residue. The biology of what persists after a stranger leaves the room is its own quiet story, and it starts much deeper in the structure than you might expect. A neuron doesn't know what it's saying. That's the part that tends to get lost. In the explanations, in the diagrams, in the clean arrows that show the signals moving from one structure to another. Somewhere in the translation it starts to sound intentional, like the brain is making a decision, like something in there is reading the situation and responding thoughtfully. But a neuron is not reading anything. It is either firing or it isn't. Right now, somewhere in the amygdala, yours specifically, the tissue sitting roughly behind each eye socket, deep in the medial temporal lobe, there are neurons that have not fired in hours. They're waiting, not consciously, not patiently, just in the particular electrochemical state that precedes activation, a resting membrane potential of around -70 millivolts, held in place by the careful movement of sodium and potassium ions across a membrane, thinner than a soap bubble. That's the baseline. That's what quiet looks like inside a cell. Then a face arrives. Not a whole face at first. The amygdala receives the rough version, a low-resolution sketch forwarded from the thalamus, before the visual cortex has finished its work. What comes through is something like eyes arranged above a nose, expression unclear, arrival sudden, the geometry of a face without its content, and certain neurons respond. The membrane potential rises. Sodium rushes inward through channels that open in milliseconds. The charge tips and the cell fires. An action potential, a pulse of electrical activity that travels down the axon at speeds between 0.5 and 120 meters per second, depending on whether the fiber is insulated with myelin. None of this feels like anything yet, but it will, because the amygdala doesn't send its signal into a void. It projects to the hypothalamus, which governs the autonomic nervous system, the branch of your nervous system that runs the body's internal state without asking for your input. Heart rate, peripheral blood flow, the tension in the muscles around your eyes. The hypothalamus receives the amygdala's signal and begins adjusting. Somewhere in the brainstem, norepinephrine is released. Adrenal glands, sitting like small hats atop each kidney, begin secreting epinephrine into the bloodstream. The heart rate nudges upward, not dramatically, not in the way of a shock or a startle, just a quiet increment. A few extra beats per minute, the pupils dilate slightly. Blood moves away from the gut and toward the large muscle groups. This is what threat preparation looks like from the inside, not an alarm. Attuning. The strange part, the part I keep coming back to, is how utterly ordinary this is. It happens dozens of times a day, in response to faces on screens, to voices through speakers, to photographs in newspapers. The amygdala cannot reliably distinguish between a threat in the room and a threat in an image. The signal arrives, the geometry matches something in its repertoire, and the downstream cascade begins. The body doesn't always know it's happening. You don't always know. There's a low hum of physiological adjustment running through most of your waking hours that you never consciously register. A slight elevation in cortisol here, a small uptick in heart rate there. The autonomic nervous system making its quiet corrections, responding to a stream of social information that never quite stops arriving. The extended metaphor I want to offer, and then set down, is this. Think of a single neuron as something like a telegraph operator in a very old relay station. It receives a signal it didn't author, transmits it forward in the only language it knows, and then returns to waiting. It has no knowledge of the message, no opinion about the destination. It simply passes the charge along. The system works because of this, because no single cell needs to understand the whole. But the metaphor breaks down almost immediately, because neurons are not passive relays. They are plastic. They change. Use a pathway repeatedly and the synapse strengthens. The neurons that fire together begin to require less stimulus to fire again. The relay station, if you stay with it too long, starts anticipating this message before it arrives, and that's where the story gets more complicated. There are neurons in the amygdala that respond preferentially to specific types of faces. Research using single-unit recordings, threading electrodes into the brain to measure the activity of individual neurons, has found cells that respond more strongly to angry expressions than neutral ones, cells that differentiate between fearful faces and calm ones. Some respond to the direction of gaze, a single neuron, one cell among roughly 12 million in the amygdala alone. And it has, through the slow shaping of experience and exposure, become more sensitive to certain signals than others. That's not instinct in the way we usually use the word. It's something more gradual, a sensitivity built over years of living in a social world, laid down in the synaptic weights of tissue you'll never see or touch. What you feel, if you feel anything, usually comes a moment later. The autonomic cascade has already begun by the time the cortex receives its version of the signal. By the time you're aware of the face, aware of something shifting in your chest or your jaw or the muscles around your eyes, the amygdala has been active for somewhere between 12 and 20 milliseconds. The feeling arrives last. It presents itself as the origin, but it isn't. There's something in that I don't quite know what to do with. The sensation of discomfort, of wariness, of that low pull away from a stranger's gaze feels immediate. Feels like it belongs to the moment. But biologically it's a report filed after the fact. A summary of something that already happened in tissue running faster than awareness. Epinephrine has a half-life in the bloodstream of roughly 2 to 3 minutes. After the stimulus is gone, after the face has passed, after the room settles, the chemistry lingers. Not long, but long enough. Which means the body is still in a mild version of that tuned state even when the social encounter is over. Still slightly elevated. Still carrying the faint charge of an evaluation that the conscious mind may have already forgotten. This is part of why a difficult conversation, or even an ambiguous one, can leave you feeling tired in a way that doesn't match the effort you put in. The fatigue isn't muscular. It's the cost of a sustained low-level physiological adjustment that ran mostly underneath your awareness for the duration. The neuron has returned to its resting state. Negative 70 millivolts. Sodium and potassium repositioned by their pumps, the membrane restored, the cell waiting again. It doesn't carry the event forward. It doesn't remember the face. Memory is built elsewhere, in the hippocampus, in the patterns of strengthened synapses distributed across the cortex. The individual neuron just fires and resets. What persists is structural. Not the firing, but what the firing changed, incrementally, in the connections between cells. And that slow accumulation, the synaptic residue of 10,000 social moments, each one contributing a fraction of a degree to the angle at which the brain leans when a stranger appears, is something the next chapter will need to sit with for a while. Because before the neuron learned to respond the way it does now, the circuit it lives inside had to be built. And the building of it started long before you were born, in nervous systems that look nothing like yours, solving problems you will never have to face. Start with the fish. Not because the fish is dramatic, it isn't, but because something in the fish's brain is still, in a meaningful biological sense, inside yours. Buried beneath the cerebral cortex, beneath the limbic structures, beneath everything that makes you capable of reading these words or forming an opinion about a stranger, there is a region of the brainstem so ancient in its architecture that it predates the vertebrate face entirely. The reticular formation, a loose netted cluster of neurons running through the core of the brainstem, governing arousal and alertness, registering the salience of incoming signals, deciding, in the only way a structure without consciousness can decide anything, what is worth attending to. It has been doing this, in one form or another, for somewhere around 500 million years. That number is genuinely difficult to hold. 500 million years ago, there were no faces. There were no eyes arranged above a nose in the particular geometry that your amygdala now responds to with such speed. There were bodies moving through water, sensing pressure changes and chemical gradients, using rudimentary nervous tissue to sort the relevant from the irrelevant. Threat or not threat. Food or not food. The categories were blunt, but the sorting was already happening, and the neural architecture that allowed it is not gone. It was built upon, elaborated, repurposed. What you experience as a first impression has roots that long. The story of how a fish's alarm response becomes a human social judgment is not a clean narrative. Evolution doesn't produce clean narratives. It produces structures that work well enough, stacked and modified over time, carrying the residue of every previous arrangement. What you have inside your skull is not a single coherent system. It is something closer to a series of additions, each one overlaid on what came before, each one retaining echoes of older priorities. Paul MacLean's triune brain model, the idea of a reptilian core, a limbic ring, a neocortical outer layer, has largely been set aside as a strict anatomical framework, because the boundaries were never as clean as the diagram suggested. But the underlying observation that drove the model isn't wrong. There are structures in the human brain that are genuinely ancient, that share organizational features with the brains of animals whose lineage diverged from ours hundreds of millions of years ago, and that continue to shape behavior in ways that feel, from the inside, nothing like evolutionary heritage. They feel like instinct. They feel like gut sense. They feel like something you know without knowing how you know it. The amygdala, which the previous chapters have already spent some time with, appears in mammals around 200 million years ago, though its precursors in reptilian and amphibian brains are older still. What's interesting, and what tends to get quietly overlooked, is that the amygdala is not a single structure. It is a collection of nuclei, the basolateral complex, the central nucleus, the medial nucleus, each with different inputs, different outputs, different evolutionary histories within the structure itself. The basolateral complex, which is primarily involved in evaluating the emotional significance of sensory input, shares organizational features with the cerebral cortex. The central nucleus is older, more brainstem-like in its wiring, more directly connected to the autonomic responses that follow a threat signal. You have, inside the amygdala alone, a kind of compressed evolutionary history, older circuitry and newer circuitry running in parallel, sometimes in concert, occasionally in a kind of low-grade tension. When you feel something about a stranger and then almost immediately feel uncertain about whether to trust that feeling, that uncertainty might not be purely cognitive. It might be two differently aged systems arriving at slightly different conclusions about the same signal. I find that quietly interesting. Not comforting exactly, just interesting in the way that old things tend to be. The question of when social evaluation specifically, the sorting of others into categories of safe and unsafe, familiar and foreign, emerged as a distinct neural process is not fully settled. What the fossil record and comparative neuroanatomy suggest is that something like it was present in early social vertebrates, fish and amphibians that lived in groups and needed to distinguish between members of their own group and outsiders. The olfactory system was likely the primary channel. Chemical signals, pheromones, scent, before visual processing became sophisticated enough to carry the load. Smell is still involved, though we rarely acknowledge it. Human axillary secretions, the compounds released from skin, carry information about immune system genotype, stress state, and potentially emotional condition. Other humans process this information, mostly unconsciously, mostly through olfactory and vomeronasal pathways that connect to the amygdala and hypothalamus without routing through the cortex first. Some of the oldest social evaluation circuitry in your brain is still running on chemical data, still sorting people partly by scent, even as the visual system does its faster, more conscious work overhead. The face is a recent development, evolutionarily speaking. The sorting is ancient. Around 65 million years ago, in the aftermath of the Cretaceous extinction, small mammals, likely nocturnal, likely social, in ways that required distinguishing between individuals, began a period of rapid neural expansion. The neocortex grew, visual processing became more sophisticated, and crucially, the brain began to develop more elaborate circuitry for tracking other individuals, not just as threats or non-threats, but as specific, recognizable others with histories and relationships and patterns of behavior. The superior temporal sulcus, which was introduced briefly in the first chapter, expanded significantly in primates. In humans, it is involved in processing the movement of biological agents, the direction of a gaze, the trajectory of a reaching arm, the subtle shifts in facial expression that carry social meaning. It connects to the amygdala, to the fusiform face area, to prefrontal regions involved in making inferences about other minds. By the time you encounter a stranger, you are running neural machinery that was assembled across at least 4 distinct evolutionary periods, each contributing a layer to what feels from the inside like a single seamless response. It isn't seamless, it just feels that way because you're inside it. There is a species of fish, the cleaner wrasse, Labroides dimidiatus, that passes a version of the mirror self-recognition test, suggesting some capacity for self-representation. There are corvids that remember individual human faces and pass that information to their offspring. There are chimpanzees whose amygdala activity, measured during social interactions, mirrors patterns found in humans making similar judgments. I'm not trying to flatten the differences. The human social brain is elaborated in ways that no other animal's is. The prefrontal cortex, the default mode network's role in mentalizing, the sheer complexity of language-mediated social cognition. These matter, but the older layers matter too. The basolateral amygdala, responding to a face before the cortex has processed it, isn't a vestigial quirk. It's an active participant. A system that was shaped across hundreds of millions of years of social survival is not simply background noise. It's running right now, in you. What strikes me so, and I don't think this resolves into anything tidy, is how much of what we call social intuition is actually very old machinery operating in a context it was never built for. The amygdala evolved in environments where the faces you encountered were probably known to you, where strangers were genuinely rare, where the threat posed by an unfamiliar individual was real and proximate in a way that has no modern equivalent for most people. Now it runs the same calculation in a subway car, in an open-plan office, scrolling through photographs of people you will never meet. The circuitry doesn't recalibrate for context. It responds to the geometry of a face with the same urgency it would have brought to a genuine threat on an open plane. The evaluation is ancient. The situation is new. The mismatch between them is running quietly in the background of most social moments you will ever have, which brings it back almost to where it started. The fish sorting pressure changes in the water. The early mammal reading sentient in the dark. The primate tracking the direction of a gaze across a canopy. And you, lying somewhere comfortable right now, with a brain that carries all of those histories inside it, not as memory, not as feeling, but as structure, as circuitry, as the particular shape of a response that begins before you know you are responding. The sorting started long before faces existed, and the strange thing, the thing worth falling asleep on, is that the face, for all its specificity, for all the elaborate neural real estate dedicated to processing it, arrived relatively late. The machinery that cares about it is old, the thing it cares about is almost new. Somewhere in the temporal lobe, a region of cortex that does nothing but process faces is waiting. Not for threat, not for familiarity, just for the geometry, the particular arrangement of features that the brain learned, over a primate lifetime of evolution, to treat as the most socially significant objects in the world. That region has a name, and what happens inside it is stranger than it sounds. Hold a coffee mug in your mind for a moment. You know what it is. You can picture the handle, the weight, the particular way light falls across a ceramic curve, but you could recognize it upside down, tilted, partially obscured, seen from an angle you've never encountered before. Your brain processes it flexibly, without much effort, without dedicating any especially privileged neural territory to the task. Now think about a face. A face in a head is deeply, almost disturbingly wrong. You feel it immediately, something off, something the brain resists, a quality of wrongness that doesn't apply to the mug at all. Flip a photograph of a face upside down and your ability to read its expression collapses almost entirely. You can see the features, you cannot read them. The processing that handles faces is, in some way that doesn't apply to objects, orientation dependent, rigid, tuned to a very specific configuration. That rigidity is the first clue that something unusual is happening. In the inferior temporal cortex, on the underside of the brain, there is a region, bilateral, roughly the size and shape of a thumb pressed flat, called the fusiform face area. It was identified and named in the late 1990s, primarily through the work of Nancy Kanwisher and colleagues using functional neuroimaging. What they found was a region that activated selectively and strongly when participants viewed faces compared to other objects, other categories, other visual stimuli. Selectively is the operative word. Show the fusiform face area a chair, a house, a hand, a word. The activation is present but moderate, the response unremarkable. Show it a face and the signal changes. The region responds with a specificity that in the landscape of cortical processing is genuinely unusual. It doesn't respond this way to anything else in quite the same way. There is a condition called prosopagnosia, face blindness. It can be acquired following stroke or traumatic brain injury, particularly to the right fusiform gyrus, or it can be developmental, present from birth, affecting somewhere between 2 and 2.5% of the population without any detectable structural brain damage. What a person with prosopagnosia experiences is not blindness in the conventional sense. Vision is intact. Objects are recognized normally. Scenes are processed. But faces, the faces of friends, family members, sometimes of their own face in a mirror, carry no automatic recognition. They are seen without being known. People with acquired prosopagnosia describe recognizing colleagues by the sound of their voice, by the way they walk, by a distinctive piece of jewelry. They develop compensatory strategies that work well enough in familiar environments and fall apart entirely in new ones. What the condition reveals in its absence is what the fusiform face area is normally doing, silently, automatically, without being asked. It is running a continuous face recognition process that you are almost never aware of. The knowing arrives before the effort. The recognition happens before the looking feels complete. Prosopagnosia removes the output and leaves everything else intact, and what's left without it is a social world that becomes suddenly, quietly exhausting to navigate. The debate around the fusiform face area is worth sitting with, because it hasn't entirely settled. One interpretation, the domain-specific view, holds that this region evolved specifically for face processing, that faces are so socially critical, so consistently present in the environment of a developing human, that a dedicated cortical module emerged to handle them. The other interpretation, or the expertise hypothesis, suggests that the fusiform face area responds strongly to faces, not because faces are special, but because humans are experts at faces. Studies showed that bird experts activate the fusiform face area more strongly when viewing birds than novices do. Car experts show heightened activation for cars. The argument is that the region is a general-purpose fine-grained discrimination system, and faces simply dominate it because we spend more time learning to distinguish between them than anything else. The honest answer is probably somewhere between these positions, and not entirely resolved. What's clear is that faces occupy a disproportionate amount of fusiform processing real estate in virtually every human brain studied, regardless of how the specialization got there. There is a phenomenon called the other race effect, sometimes called the cross-race effect, in which faces from racial groups other than one's own are recognized less accurately and processed somewhat differently in the fusiform face area. The effect is robust across cultures and appears early in development. The most supported explanation is experiential. The fusiform face area is shaped by exposure. It becomes tuned to the statistical regularities of the faces it encounters most frequently during development. Faces that fall outside those regularities are processed less efficiently. Not because of any categorical neural decision, but because the fine-grained discrimination system hasn't been trained on them to the same degree. It is a perceptual bias with a developmental origin, which makes it neither fixed nor simple. What it means biologically is that recognition itself, the felt sense of a face as readable, as familiar in type even when unknown individually, is partly a product of who you grew up around. The fusiform face area is not a neutral recorder. It has a history. It was shaped by a particular social environment, and that shaping is visible in what it finds easy and what it finds difficult. There is something the fusiform face area does that still doesn't have a fully satisfying explanation. Faces elicit a specific electrical signal in the brain, measurable with EEG, called the N170. It appears roughly 170 milliseconds after a face is shown, predominantly over the right occipitotemporal scalp regions. It is larger and earlier for faces than for any other object category. It appears even for faces that are shown too briefly for conscious recognition. The N170 is not recognition. It precedes recognition. It is the brain flagging that something face-like has arrived, before it has determined whose face it is or what expression it carries. An inverted face still produces an N170, but it is delayed and slightly altered, as if the system detects the face-like structure but struggles with the configuration. The signal is there, something is off about it. What this suggests is a two-stage process. First, fast and automatic detection of face-like structure, the presence of something with the geometry of a face, and second, a slower process of identification and expression reading that requires proper orientation, familiarity, and the involvement of other regions. The first stage is nearly impossible to suppress. You cannot stop your brain from flagging a face, and this is perhaps the strangest part. Pareidolia, the perception of faces in random patterns, is generated by the same system. The face in the wood grain, the two dots and a curve on a coffee cup, the cloud formation that looks unmistakably like a profile. The fusiform face area activates for these. The N170 fires. The system responds to the geometry of a face even when there is no face. It is not a malfunction. It is the system working exactly as calibrated and set to detect face-like structure with such sensitivity that it accepts false positives rather than risk missing the real thing. In the environment the circuit was built for, missing a face was the greater error. The mug you thought about at the beginning of this, you can turn it any direction and it remains a mug. A face is not like that. A face is processed by a system that cares specifically about configuration, about the arrangement of features relative to each other, about orientation, about the particular geometry of two eyes above a nose above a mouth, set in a specific spatial relationship that the brain has been calibrated to detect since before you could speak. That calibration is still running, right now, even in the dark. Even with your eyes closed, the circuit is there, ready, tuned, oriented toward a category of object that your brain has decided, over a lifetime of social living, matters more than almost anything else it will ever see. What it does with the face once it has found it, how it reads the surface of another person for signals that were never meant to be hidden, is a slower and older process than the detection itself, and it starts in a part of the face that most people never consciously watch. You've felt it before, not the feeling itself, or not only that, but the particular strangeness of noticing a feeling that arrived without being invited, without a clear cause you can point to, without a story attached to it yet, a slight drawing in, a loosening, something in the chest that isn't quite an emotion but isn't nothing either. It was already there before you named it. Affective neuroscience has a term for this: core effect. It refers to a continuous low-level background state of the body, not an emotion in the full sense, not a labelled experience, but a fluctuating baseline of valence and arousal that runs underneath everything else. Valence meaning the lean of the state, toward or away, pleasant or unpleasant, open or contracted. Arousal meaning the energy of it, activated or quiet, alert or dim. These two dimensions are running right now, in you. They shift across the day in response to light, food, social contact, the quality of air in a room. The particular way a stranger held eye contact a moment too long. You didn't decide any of it, the state just moved. The body structures most responsible for the background current are not the ones that come to mind when people think about emotion. Not the prefrontal cortex, not the hippocampus, not yet. The interoceptive system, the insular cortex, the anterior cingulate. These are regions that process signals from inside the body itself: heart rate, gut tension, the subtle pressure of the diaphragm, the temperature of the skin, and translate them into something the rest of the brain can use. The insula in particular sits folded inside the lateral sulcus, hidden from the brain's outer surface, and receives a continuous stream of visceral input. What it does with that input is not quite perception and not quite emotion. It produces something like a felt sense of the body's current state. A rough, wordless summary of how things are going internally. That summary influences everything. When a face appears, a stranger's face, ambiguous, expression not quite readable, the insula's background report is already part of the context in which the amygdala processes the signal. If the body is already in a mild state of tension, already carrying a slightly elevated heart rate, already running a low hum of unease from something earlier in the day, the amygdala's response to the ambiguous face tilts differently than it would in a body that arrived at the moment calm. The feeling shapes the perception before the perception has fully formed. This is one of the reasons the same face can feel different on different days. Not because the face changed, because the interoceptive background changed, because the body you brought to the encounter was in a different state, and that state became part of the evaluation without announcing itself. There's a specific physiological signature that appears during social evaluation, before conscious recognition, before any labelled emotion. Skin conductance rises, fractionally, almost imperceptibly but measurably. The eccrine sweat glands in the palms and fingertips respond to sympathetic nervous system activation, and the activation can precede the awareness of any emotional state by several seconds. The skin knows something the mind hasn't caught up to yet. This isn't mysticism, it's the autonomic nervous system running faster than cortical processing, the same basic timing difference that runs through every chapter of this subject. The body's responses are not slow, they are in many cases ahead of experience. Valence, that lean toward or away, is processed partly in the orbitofrontal cortex, a region sitting just above the eye sockets behind the forehead. It integrates sensory information with stored value signals, what has felt good before, what has felt threatening, and contributes to the overall tone of a moment. The orbitofrontal cortex doesn't produce a verdict, it produces a gradient, a slope, a direction the evaluation is already moving in, and that direction gets felt in the body before it gets thought in the mind. The slight opening in the chest when someone feels immediately warm, the faint closing off, the subtle rearrangement of posture when someone feels immediately unsafe. These are not metaphors for psychological states. They are the physiological components of those states running in parallel with the neural evaluation, sometimes running slightly ahead of it. What's strange, and this is where it gets harder to articulate without drifting into imprecision, is that the labelled emotion, the named feeling, arrives after all of this. The conscious experience of I feel uneasy, or I feel drawn toward this person, is constructed partly from the physiological signals the body is already generating. Lisa Feldman Barrett's theory of constructed emotion argues that emotions are not discrete preformed states that get triggered by stimuli. They are the brain's attempt to make sense of a complex interoceptive signal, to find a concept that fits the body's current state and the current context. The feeling gets named by matching a body state to a category the brain has learned from experience to apply, which means the name you give a feeling is not a discovery, it's a construction, a best guess. The biology came first. Right now there is a state in your body, not dramatic, not particularly legible, just a tone, a temperature, the particular weight of a late hour in a quiet room, and a mind that has been thinking about other minds for a while now. The insula is processing it. The anterior cingulate is integrating it with whatever attention is still running. The orbitofrontal cortex is doing something with it. You probably don't have a name for it. That's fine, it doesn't need one. The feeling that arrives without a name before a stranger's face is fully processed, before the cortex has assembled its verdict, that feeling is not a mistake in the system. It is the system working exactly as it evolved to work. The body's early warning signal. The interoceptive report filed before the deliberate evaluation begins. It's just that in modern life, the signal is constant. The faces are continuous. The evaluation never fully stops. And somewhere between the insula's quiet report and the orbitofrontal cortex's gradient and the skin conductance rising in the palm, there is a feeling, nameless for a moment, already shaping what comes next. Like a room that has already been arranged before you walk into it. You didn't choose the arrangement, but you'll move through it as if you did. The body's cost for running this evaluation continuously, quietly, across every social encounter in a day, is not zero. There is a chemistry to sustained vigilance, a hormone involved in almost everything, misunderstood in almost everything, that rises and falls with social stress in ways that leave a physical residue. That's where the next chapter goes, into the slow chemistry of always watching. Before the alarm goes off, cortisol is already rising. This is not a stress response. This is the cortisol awakening response, a sharp, deliberate surge in cortisol that begins roughly 20 to 30 minutes before waking, orchestrated by the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus, which has been tracking light and darkness and the body's internal clock through the night. By the time you open your eyes, cortisol in the bloodstream has already peaked, sometimes reaching 2 to 3 times the baseline level of the previous evening. The body has prepared the system for the day before the day has begun. Resources mobilized, glucose released into the bloodstream, immune activity modulated, attention primed. It is, in a sense, the body's opening bid on the coming hours. The suprachiasmatic nucleus sends its signal through the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, a cascade that begins in the hypothalamus, moves to the pituitary gland at the base of the brain, and terminates in the adrenal cortex, the outer layer of the small gland sitting atop each kidney. The adrenal cortex synthesizes cortisol from cholesterol, a slow enzymatic process involving several intermediate compounds, and releases it into the bloodstream, where it travels to virtually every tissue in the body. Cortisol receptors exist in the brain, the heart, the gut, the skin, the immune cells. There are very few biological processes cortisol does not touch in some way, which is part of why it is so easy to misunderstand. The popular version of cortisol is simple: stress hormone, bad, elevated by anxiety, lowered by the meditation and deep breathing, and a better morning routine. This version is not entirely wrong, but it is so compressed as to be almost misleading. Cortisol is not a pathogen. It is not something the body produces by mistake. It is one of the most important regulatory molecules in human physiology, involved in metabolism, immune function, memory consolidation, inflammation control, sleep architecture, and the calibration of the stress response itself. The problem is not cortisol. The problem is the pattern of its release. A healthy cortisol profile looks something like a wave with a steep morning rise and a long, gradual descent across the day, reaching its lowest point in the hours before midnight, a curve called the diurnal rhythm. This rhythm is not incidental. It is deeply functional. The morning peak mobilizes energy for the demands of waking life. The gradual decline allows the body to transition toward rest, to shift immune activity, to consolidate memory, to prepare the architecture of sleep. Disrupt the wave, and almost everything downstream feels it. Social evaluation disrupts the wave, not catastrophically, not in a way that registers as dramatic, but repeatedly, quietly across the course of a day. Each time the amygdala flags a face as potentially threatening or socially significant, a small activation of the HPA axis follows. The hypothalamus releases corticotropin-releasing hormone. The pituitary responds with adrenocorticotropic hormone. The adrenal cortex releases cortisol. The whole cascade from hypothalamic signal to cortisol in the bloodstream takes somewhere between 2 and 15 minutes depending on the intensity of the trigger and the individual's baseline reactivity. By the time the cortisol arrives, the face is usually gone, the encounter has passed, the moment is over, but the cortisol is still there, still circulating, still bound to receptors in the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus and the immune tissue lining the gut. Its half-life in the bloodstream is roughly 60 to 90 minutes. So the physiological residue of a mildly stressful social encounter at 11 in the morning is still present in some form at noon. And if another encounter has occurred in the meantime, another activation, another small cascade, the cortisol accumulates, not as a spike but as a raised floor. A baseline that doesn't quite return to where it was. This is what chronic social stress looks like from the inside of the endocrine system. Not a single dramatic event. A series of small overlapping waves that never fully recede. Think of it for a moment as something like compound interest on a loan the body didn't choose to take out. Each activation borrows slightly against the system's regulatory capacity. Each incomplete recovery leaves the baseline fractionally higher than it should be. Over days and weeks, the cumulative effect shows up in places far removed from the original stress. Disrupted sleep architecture, altered immune function, changes in the hippocampus's structural density. The hippocampus, the seahorse-shaped structure central to memory formation, is particularly sensitive to sustained cortisol elevation. Prolonged high cortisol suppresses neurogenesis in the hippocampal dentate gyrus and can reduce dendritic branching in hippocampal neurons. This is not a minor effect. The hippocampus is involved in contextualizing the amygdala's threat signals, helping the brain determine whether a current situation resembles a genuinely dangerous past one. When hippocampal function is compromised, the amygdala's signals become harder to contextualize. The brake system weakens, but set that aside for a moment. Because what's more immediately interesting, more quietly present in an ordinary day, is the effect of sustained cortisol on perception. Elevated cortisol narrows attentional focus toward potential threats. It biases the visual system toward negative stimuli. It enhances memory consolidation for emotionally salient events, while impairing the encoding of neutral ones. A day lived under mild but sustained cortisol elevation is a day in which the brain is, in small but measurable ways, more alert to the dangerous and less attentive to the benign. Which means the social evaluation circuit doesn't just cost the body energy, it shapes what the body perceives. A stranger encountered during a high cortisol afternoon is evaluated by a brain that is already primed for threat detection, already biased toward negative interpretation, already consolidating the difficult moments of the day more firmly than the easy ones. The evaluation is not neutral. The chemistry has already tilted it. There is a hormone called dehydroepiandrosterone, DHEA, that is co-released with cortisol from the adrenal cortex and which functions in some ways as a physiological counterbalance. Higher ratios of DHEA to cortisol are associated with better stress resilience, better cognitive function under pressure, better immune outcomes. The ratio matters as much as the cortisol level alone. What determines the ratio is not entirely within conscious control, but it is not fixed either. Sleep quality influences it. The perception of a stressor as manageable versus overwhelming influences it. Social support, the felt sense of not being alone in a difficulty, influences it in ways that are measurable in the blood. This is where the biology starts to feel less like a mechanical system and more like something that listens, not metaphorically, in the literal sense that the adrenal cortex's output is influenced by the brain's appraisal of a social situation, and the brain's appraisal of a social situation is influenced by whether the person feels held within a social context they trust. The chemistry of vigilance is partially written by the quality of connection. By evening, in a healthy diurnal rhythm, cortisol should be near its lowest. The long descent from the morning peak should have run its course. The body should be beginning its shift toward the different hormonal landscape of sleep. Prolactin rising, growth hormone preparing to pulse, melatonin ascending from the pineal gland. But if the day has involved sustained social evaluation, and most days do for most people living in proximity to many other people, the floor may not have returned to where it needs to be. The baseline may be slightly elevated. The wave may not have fallen as far as it should, and a cortisol level that is higher than appropriate for the hour of night disrupts the first half of sleep, the slow wave stages, the deep restorative architecture during which the body repairs tissue, consolidates memory, and runs its own version of overnight maintenance. The watching costs something. It is paid partly at night, in the quality of the repair the sleeping body can manage. None of this is catastrophic in the individual instance. One difficult day, one elevated cortisol curve, one slightly disrupted night of sleep, the body absorbs these without lasting consequence. The system is built with recovery in mind. It expects occasional disruption. What it didn't entirely anticipate, in the environment that shaped it, was the continuous low-grade social evaluation load of a life lived among hundreds of strangers every day, with no period of genuine social rest. The circuit was calibrated for a different density of social contact. It runs anyway. It does its best. It watches and flags and activates the cascade, and the cortisol rises and falls and rises again, And somewhere in the adrenal cortex, the cells that synthesize cortisol from cholesterol keep doing their slow enzymatic work, patient and unhurried, with no particular awareness that the threat that triggered them has long since left the room. What the cortisol leaves behind in the brain, in the particular structures that sort people into categories of familiar and foreign, safe and uncertain, is not just fatigue. It is a subtle shift in how the social world is read. And reading the social world differently, depending on whose face is in front of you and what group that face seems to belong to, turns out to have its own neural story, one that runs deeper than it first appears. There is a child somewhere around 3 months old who already shows a preference, not a reasoned one, not one that could be explained or defended, just a measurable lean, a longer gaze, a slower look away, toward faces that resemble the faces most present in the environment since birth. The preference is not for beauty, not for symmetry, not for any feature that can be named easily. It is for familiarity in the statistical sense, for the particular distribution of features, the particular range of skin tones and facial structures that have appeared most frequently in the visual field since the first days of life. At 3 months, the face processing system is already being shaped by exposure, already developing a gradient of recognition that will, over years and decades, influence how quickly a face is processed, how easily it is remembered, how readily the brain assigns it the full depth of social elaboration that it gives to faces it considers familiar in type. This is where the in-group/out-group distinction begins, not in ideology, not in language, in the statistical learning of a visual system that is trying, as all neural systems try, to build a model of the world from the inputs it receives. The medial prefrontal cortex sits roughly behind the center of the forehead, a region involved in what neuroscientists call mentalizing, or theory of mind, the capacity to represent the mental states of other people, to model their intentions and beliefs and feelings as distinct from your own. It is one of the structures that makes social life as elaborate as it is. Without it, other people remain behaviorally predictable but psychologically opaque. With it, you can imagine what someone else is thinking without being told. What fMRI studies have consistently shown is that the medial prefrontal cortex responds more elaborately, with greater activation, with richer associated activity in connected regions, to faces perceived as belonging to one's own social group than to faces perceived as belonging to an outgroup. More elaborately is the careful phrase here. Not simply more, the quality of the processing changes. In-group faces tend to activate the neural circuitry associated with individuation, the process of seeing a face as a specific person with specific characteristics, rather than as a member of a category. Outgroup faces, particularly those from groups with which the perceiver has little contact, sometimes activate the neural circuitry associated with object processing to a greater degree than person processing. This is not a comfortable finding. It is also not a simple one. The amygdala's role here is worth returning to, because it is more nuanced than the basic threat detection story suggests. Early studies using fMRI reported greater amygdala activation for outgroup faces, particularly for faces of racial outgroups, and this was often interpreted as evidence that the brain treats outgroup members as more threatening. Subsequent research complicated that picture considerably. The amygdala response to outgroup faces is variable across individuals, sensitive to context, and modulated by factors including implicit bias scores, intergroup contact history, and the emotional expression on the face being evaluated. What seems closer to the current understanding is that the amygdala responds to novelty and social uncertainty as much as to threat specifically. An outgroup face, particularly one from a group rarely encountered, carries more perceptual uncertainty. The brain has less experience processing its features, less familiarity with the statistical regularities of its expressions, and responds with a slightly elevated alerting signal that is not precisely threat but is not neutral either. Familiarity quiets the amygdala. Novelty activates it. The difference between those two states, at the neural level, looks like the beginning of a social category. There is a structure called the temporoparietal junction, sitting roughly at the meeting point of the temporal and parietal lobes, above and behind the ear, that is involved in perspective taking, in the simulation of another person's point of view. It activates when you try to understand what someone else is experiencing, when you step mentally into another person's situation. Research has found that the temporoparietal junction responds differently depending on perceived group membership. For in-group members, the region is recruited more readily, more automatically, with less apparent effort. For out-group members, particularly for members of groups that are socially devalued or unfamiliar, the perspective-taking response can be diminished, slower to engage, more dependent on an explicit instruction or motivation. The brain's capacity for empathy is not switched on or off by group membership, but its ease of application, the automaticity with which it extends toward another person, is influenced by the neural gradient that the in-group/out-group processing system creates. What this means, in practical terms, is that the mental effort required to imagine another person's inner life varies, not because the capacity is absent, but because the circuitry runs more smoothly in one direction than the other. Empathy toward familiar others runs on a well-worn path. Empathy toward unfamiliar others requires something closer to a deliberate choice to engage the circuit that doesn't activate automatically. This is the part worth sitting with slowly, because the gradient is not fixed. It is not a property of the brain. The way the fusiform face area's preference for upright faces is a property, something baked in, resistant to modification. The in-group-out-group neural response is experience-dependent in ways that matter enormously. Extended contact with members of an out-group, not incidental proximity, but contact involving cooperation, shared goals, roughly equal status, reduces the amygdala's alerting response to out-group faces. It increases the elaborateness of medial prefrontal cortex processing. It shifts the perceptual familiarity gradient. The temporoparietal junction activates more readily. The brain is doing something the mind might describe as learning to see someone. But what is actually happening is more specific. The neural systems that process faces are accumulating exposure, building statistical models, and recalibrating the gradient that determines how much social elaboration a face receives. This is not an argument about effort or willingness or moral position. It is a description of how a biological system that was shaped by experience continues to be shaped by experience across a lifetime. The circuit that created the gradient can, with the right inputs, revise it. There is something I find quietly significant about the developmental timeline here. The way the gradient begins so early, before language, before any capacity for abstract social reasoning, in the visual system of a 3-month-old tracking faces in a room. It means that by the time a person is old enough to think about group membership explicitly, to have opinions about it, to form beliefs, to choose positions, the neural gradient is already years in the making. The biology arrived first. The ideology, whatever form it takes, gets laid on top of a substrate that was already tilted. This doesn't mean the ideology doesn't matter. It does. Explicit beliefs and social norms and deliberate choices about contact and exposure can and do modify the underlying neural pattern. But they are working on something that started before they did. The gradient preceded the opinion. There is a particular finding in the Ingroup/Outgroup literature that tends to quiet a room when it comes up. When participants are arbitrarily divided into groups, assigned at random to a blue team or a red team, given minimal information about group identity, told almost nothing about what the group means, the medial prefrontal cortex already shows a slight preference for processing in-group faces more elaborately. The bias emerges with the essentially no content. No shared history, no common values, no meaningful similarity, just a label. The label is enough. What this suggests is that the neural machinery for in-group preference doesn't require a real group. It requires only the perception that a group exists and that you belong to it. The categorization itself is sufficient to begin tilting the gradient, which makes the boundary between in-group and out-group less a description of something real and more a threshold, a line the brain draws in response to available information, which can be moved by changing the information. The warmth the brain extends toward familiar others, the slight cooling toward unfamiliar ones. These are not character traits. They are not moral positions. They are the outputs of a neural system that was built over an evolutionary history spent in small, relatively homogeneous social groups to maintain the distinction between those who could be trusted without extensive evaluation and those who required more careful processing. The system was efficient for its original context. It saved processing resources. It allowed fast allocation of trust and cooperation within a group while maintaining appropriate vigilance toward those outside it. The context changed. The system is still running. And the porosity of the boundary, the degree to which the gradient can shift, the ease with which the temporoparietal junction can be brought online for a new face, the capacity of contact and cooperation to recalibrate the amygdala's response, suggests that the system, despite its age, is not closed. It remains, in a meaningful biological sense, open to revision. What the body stores from all of this, from the years of faces that activated the gradient one way and then another, from the encounters that quieted the amygdala and the ones that didn't, from the slow accumulation of social experience that the brain never quite discards, lives somewhere that isn't memory in the way we usually think of it. It lives in the nervous system's texture, in the particular slope of its readiness. And what that stored history does to the way you respond to a new face is the next quiet question. Something in you already knows this room. Not this room specifically, not these walls or this particular quality of quiet, but the felt sense of a room at this hour, the specific weight of late-night stillness, the way the body arranges itself differently when no one is watching. This is familiar in a way that precedes memory. Your nervous system has been here before, not here, just this. That's not quite memory. It's closer to what memory leaves behind after the event itself has dissolved. There is a distinction in neuroscience between two kinds of memory that are easy to conflate and important to keep apart. Declarative memory, sometimes called explicit memory, is the kind you can narrate, the kind you can retrieve and report. What happened, when, where, who was there. It depends heavily on the hippocampus, on the slow consolidation of experience into retrievable form during sleep, on the prefrontal cortex's capacity to organize and sequence events in time. Implicit memory is different. It doesn't narrate, it doesn't surface as a recollection. It shows up instead as a change in behavior, a shift in response latency, a modification of the body's readiness that has no accompanying story. You move differently because of it. You tighten or open without knowing why. The memory is there, encoded in the synaptic weights of circuits that were shaped by experience, but it has no face, no date, no language. What the body carries about other people is mostly implicit. The amygdala is involved in both kinds, but its relationship to implicit emotional memory is older, deeper, and in some ways more durable than its relationship to the kind of memory you can consciously access. Joseph Ledoux's research on fear conditioning demonstrated that the amygdala can encode conditioned fear responses, the association between a neutral stimulus and an aversive one, even in animals with hippocampal lesions. The hippocampus was gone. The declarative memory of the conditioning event was gone with it, but the conditioned fear response remained. The body still flinched, still showed the physiological signature of threat when the neutral stimulus appeared. The memory that mattered for survival didn't need a story, it just needed a trigger and a response. In humans, this same architecture means that a body of experience with other people, across years, across repeated encounters, across the slow accumulation of who felt safe and who did not, can be encoded in the amygdala and its connected circuitry without producing a single retrievable memory. You don't remember why a certain kind of voice makes your shoulders drop slightly. You just know that it does. Think of it for a moment as sediment. Rivers carry particles that settle layer by layer at the bottom, each layer a record of a different season, a different flow, a different composition of what the water was carrying. The layers don't announce themselves. They don't advertise their history. But drill down and you find time, compressed into texture. The nervous system lays down something similar. Not literally, neurons are not sediment, but the metaphor holds in its structure. Each significant social encounter deposits a slight modification in the synaptic landscape. The change is small. The accumulated change across a childhood, across years of social living, across thousands of interactions that were processed and then apparently forgotten, is not small at all. What remains is not the memory. What remains is the inclination. The particular angle at which the amygdala leans when a new face arrives that shares features of voice, of posture, of expression, of context, with the ones already encoded. Set the metaphor down. The literal version is this. The basolateral amygdala forms associations between sensory features and emotional valence. Those associations strengthen with repetition. Over time, certain constellations of sensory features, a particular tone of voice, a certain quality of eye contact, a specific facial expression during conflict, acquire a learned valence that activates automatically, without deliberate recall, when encountered again. The body remembers the feeling. The mind doesn't remember the lesson. There is a concept in developmental psychology called the internal working model, proposed by John Bowlby as part of attachment theory, which describes the mental and emotional templates formed through early caregiving relationships. The quality of early attachment experiences shapes not just psychological expectations, but neural architecture. The development of the orbitofrontal cortex, the calibration of the stress response system, the baseline reactivity of the amygdala. Neuroscience has since found the biological substrate of what Bowlby was describing. Early caregiving environments, the consistency or inconsistency of comfort, the predictability or unpredictability of social response, shape the HPA axis's reactivity, the amygdala's threshold for threat detection, and the prefrontal cortex's capacity to regulate amygdala responses. These are not psychological outcomes in some abstract sense. They are measurable differences in tissue and circuit, in the density of glucocorticoid receptors in the hippocampus, in the strength of prefrontal amygdala connectivity, in the resting tone of the autonomic nervous system. The body of an adult is partly constructed from the social experiences of the child, not as trauma necessarily, and not only as that, but as calibration, as the particular settings the system arrived at given the social environment it developed inside. This is where it gets quietly strange. Because implicit emotional memory, unlike declarative memory, is not easily revised by new information. You can learn explicitly that a certain kind of person is safe. You can hold that belief sincerely, defend it rationally, build a worldview around it. And the amygdala may still register a fractional alerting response when that person appears. Not because the belief is wrong, but because the implicit system doesn't update the way the explicit system does. The implicit memory doesn't care what you've decided. It responds to what it learned in a different time under different conditions through a process that had no language and left no story. The two systems run in parallel. They don't always agree, and the felt sense of knowing someone, the quiet certainty that a particular person is safe, or the equally quiet unease about someone who gives no rational reason for it, is often the result of this negotiation between systems, between what the body has stored implicitly and what the mind has constructed explicitly. Both are real, neither is complete. There is a face you haven't thought about in years, maybe a teacher, a neighbour, someone from a room in your past whose name has gone soft at the edges. You wouldn't necessarily recognise them if they appeared now, not quickly, not with the ease of recognition reserved for faces you've seen recently. But if they spoke, and the voice carried a particular quality, something in the body might shift. A slight familiarity, a faint lean toward or away, not memory, the residue of memory. The nervous system carried something forward that the mind let go of. It does this constantly, quietly, without mentioning it, carrying forward the valence of encounters that the declarative system has long since released, shaping the readiness with which you approach new people who carry echoes of old ones. The body's record of who felt safe is not stored anywhere you can look at directly. It doesn't have a location, it isn't a file. It is distributed across the synaptic weights of circuits spread through the amygdala, the insula, the anterior cingulate, the orbitofrontal cortex, each one holding a fraction of what experience deposited, none of them holding the whole. When a new face arrives, these circuits activate in combination. The pattern of their activation, which fires first, how strongly, what it connects to, is shaped by every similar face that came before, not deliberately, not consciously, but shaped unmistakably by history. You meet a stranger, your nervous system meets an echo, and so it comes back to where this chapter began. The familiar feeling of a late room, the particular weight of a body at rest, the sense arriving before any thought that this is known, not from memory but from something older and quieter than memory. The nervous system has been accumulating its record of what safety feels like since the first social encounters of a life, not writing it down, not storing it in a form that can be retrieved, just carrying it forward in the texture of its readiness, in the slope of its response, in the quiet lean it brings to every new encounter. You don't need to remember the faces that taught your body what safety was. The body already did. The chemistry that allows for this kind of social learning, the molecule most associated with trust and closeness and the felt sense of being near someone safe, is more complicated than its reputation suggests. It doesn't simply open you to others, it sharpens the edges of who belongs and who doesn't, in ways that are worth understanding slowly. The name arrived before the understanding did. Oxytocin was identified and named in the early 20th century, from the Greek for swift birth, because its first known function was the stimulation of uterine contractions during labour and the triggering of milk letdown during nursing. For decades it was understood primarily as a peripheral hormone, released from the posterior pituitary gland into the bloodstream, acting on smooth muscle, governing the mechanics of reproduction and infant feeding. The social story came later, much later, and more slowly than the popular version suggests. What the research of the 1990s and early 2000s began to reveal was that oxytocin was also being produced centrally, in the hypothalamus, in the paraventricular nucleus and the supraoptic nucleus, and released not into the bloodstream but directly into the brain via axonal projections and what is called volume transmission, a kind of diffuse release that allows the molecule to spread through cerebrospinal fluid and reach receptor populations across a wide range of brain regions simultaneously. The brain, it turned out, was bathing itself in oxytocin, and the effects of this central release were distinct from the peripheral ones, quieter, more complex, more deeply embedded in the machinery of social life. Think of oxytocin's action in the brain for a moment as something like a lighting adjustment in a large room with many different light sources. The molecule doesn't add a single bright lamp in the center. It changes the quality and intensity of light across the whole space. Some areas brightening, others dimming, the overall atmosphere shifting in a way that is difficult to trace back to any single change, different regions, different receptor densities, different outcomes. The oxytocin receptor, a G protein coupled receptor, is distributed unevenly across the brain. The amygdala has a high density of oxytocin receptors, so does the nucleus accumbens, the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, the hippocampus, the brainstem's dorsal raphe nucleus. The prefrontal cortex has receptors, but fewer. The distribution is not random, it reflects the evolutionary history of the molecule. The functions it was recruited to serve as social life became more elaborate in mammalian lineages. What this uneven geography means is that oxytocin does not have a single effect. It has many effects simultaneously, some of which are in tension with each other. And understanding the molecule means following the geography rather than looking for a single story. In the amygdala, oxytocin generally reduces the firing rate of neurons in the central and basolateral nuclei. The alerting signal quiets, the vigilance tone drops. Studies using intranasal oxytocin administration, a method that allows some central uptake, though the degree of central penetration is still debated, have shown reduced amygdala responses to threatening faces, reduced cortisol reactivity in social stress paradigms, reduced physiological arousal during conflict. This is the version of oxytocin that became famous, the calming of the threat response, the opening of the social space. But the amygdala reduction is context-dependent. It occurs most reliably in the presence of in-group members, people perceived as familiar, as belonging to the same social group, as safe in the gradient that the previous chapter traced. In the presence of out-group members, the oxytocin effect on the amygdala is different, sometimes absent, sometimes reversed. This is where the popular story starts to come apart. Paul Zach's early work on oxytocin and trust, later translated into the public idea of oxytocin as a trust molecule or moral molecule, captured something real but described it incompletely. Oxytocin does increase trust, but it increases trust specifically toward in-group members, and it does so partly by sharpening the contrast between in-group and out-group. A series of studies by Carsten de Dreux and colleagues showed that intranasal oxytocin increased cooperative behavior within groups, while simultaneously increasing defensive aggression toward out-group members in competitive contexts. In economic games involving intergroup conflict, oxytocin-treated participants were more willing to sacrifice personal resources to harm the outgroup, not out of hostility in any rich psychological sense, but out of an intensified investment in protecting the in-group. The molecule that made the in-group warmer also made the boundary harder. This is not a flaw in the molecule's design. It is the design. In the environment, oxytocin's social functions evolved, Small kin groups, in-group cooperation as a survival strategy, genuine threat from competing groups, a molecule that simultaneously increased in-group cohesion and out-group vigilance was not contradictory. It was efficient. The context changed. The molecule did not. There is a region called the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, a small cluster of neurons connecting the amygdala to the hypothalamus, involved in sustained anxiety rather than acute fear, that has a particularly high density of oxytocin receptors. When oxytocin acts here, it tends to reduce prolonged anxiety responses, to quiet the low hum of background vigilance that the previous chapter described as cortisol's companion. This is the mechanism behind oxytocin's role in what researchers call social buffering, the phenomenon whereby the presence of a trusted social partner reduces the physiological stress response. In rodent studies, an isolated animal shows elevated corticosterone in response to a mild stressor. The same animal, in the presence of a familiar cage mate, shows a blunted response. The familiar presence is not doing anything active, it is simply present, and the nervous system responds to its presence by down-regulating the threat circuitry. The effect in humans is measurable in similar terms. Blood pressure response to a stressor is lower in the presence of a trusted partner. Cortisol reactivity is reduced. The amygdala's response to threatening stimuli is dampened. The nervous system reads the presence of a trusted other as information, as evidence that the current situation is less dangerous than it might otherwise be, and adjusts its output accordingly. Oxytocin is part of the mechanism that allows another person's presence to change the chemistry of your threat response. The extended metaphor dissolves here, because what comes next is too specific for it. The nucleus accumbens, the structure most associated with the reward processing, with dopamine release in response to pleasurable stimuli, also carries oxytocin receptors. And in this region, oxytocin interacts with the dopaminergic system in ways that contribute to social reward. The felt pleasurableness of positive social contact, the reinforcing quality of trust and reciprocity, the particular satisfaction of a social interaction that goes well. This is why social connection feels good in a way that food and warmth feel good, because it is activating overlapping reward circuitry, in some cases through the same pathways. The nucleus accumbens doesn't distinguish rigidly between categories of reward. It responds to salience and value. And in a social species, other people, trusted, familiar, in-group, are among the most valuable stimuli the environment regularly presents. What oxytocin does in the nucleus accumbens is not produce the reward. It modulates the circuitry that makes social stimuli salient enough to generate one. It adjusts the volume at which the social world registers. The hippocampus receives oxytocin projections too, and here the effects are subtler and less well characterized. There is evidence that oxytocin facilitates social memory, the encoding and retrieval of information about specific individuals. In rodents, oxytocin receptor knockout produces animals that can form memories normally, but cannot distinguish familiar conspecifics from novel ones. The recognition memory is intact. The social recognition, the capacity to identify a known individual as known, is selectively disrupted. What this suggests is that oxytocin is involved not just in the emotional quality of social connection, but in the basic perceptual capacity to recognize social partners as individuals, to treat them as specific people with histories rather than as instances of a category. This maps onto the in-group-out-group gradient in an interesting way. In-group members are more likely to be processed as individuals. Out-group members are more likely to be processed categorically. If oxytocin facilitates individual recognition, and if it does so more reliably in in-group contexts, then the molecule may be contributing to the differential depth of social processing that the previous chapter described in neural terms. The individuation runs deeper for the familiar. Oxytocin is part of why. Trust, then, is not a decision in the way the word sometimes implies. It is a biological state, one with a molecular substrate, a receptor geography, a dependence on context and prior experience and the particular people present in the room. It rises and falls with oxytocin release. It is shaped by the Ingroup gradient. It is buffered or eroded by the body's cortisol history. It is encoded partly in implicit memory, accessible partly through conscious evaluation, modulated by a molecule that was doing versions of this work long before humans had a word for it. The edge of trust, the boundary between where the nervous system opens and where it maintains its careful watchfulness, is not drawn by the mind. It is drawn by chemistry, by receptor density, by the accumulated social history that shaped how the chemistry responds, which makes it more porous than it seems and more stubborn than it sometimes feels. Right now, the oxytocin your hypothalamus has released today is gone. Its half-life in the bloodstream is approximately 3 minutes. Its central effects last somewhat longer. The receptor activation and downstream signaling can persist for tens of minutes after the initial release, but it does not accumulate. It does not pool. It is released in pulses in response to specific social triggers: touch, eye contact, positive social interaction, the felt sense of being trusted, and then it clears. What it leaves behind is not the molecule itself. It is the state the molecule helped produce, a nervous system that was, for a period, running in a slightly different register, slightly more open, slightly less vigilant, the particular quality of a conversation that felt easy, or a moment of contact that felt uncomplicated. The chemistry passed. The residue of it is harder to locate. Underneath all of this, the amygdala's gradient, the cortisol accumulation, the oxytocin pulses, the implicit records the body keeps, there is a surface, a moving, expressive surface that leaks information that was never meant to be read. The face doing what faces do, telling the truth before the mind has decided whether to. 40 milliseconds. That's roughly how long a microexpression lasts at its briefest. 40 to 500 milliseconds, depending on the classification, depending on the study, depending on how strictly the term is applied. But at the short end, 40 milliseconds, less than a single frame of standard film. A duration so compressed that the conscious visual system, processing at its own unhurried pace, simply misses it entirely, and yet something in the brain catches it. Paul Ekman's work on facial expression, begun in the 1960s, controversial in some of its broader claims, foundational in its specific observations, identified a category of expressions he called microexpressions, brief, involuntary facial movements that occur when a genuine emotional state conflicts with the presented one. When the body knows something the face is trying not to say. The classic example is a suppressed emotion. Someone receiving news they were expecting but pretending to find surprising, someone concealing distress behind a composed expression. The genuine emotion arising from subcortical circuits that don't wait for social permission briefly animates the face. And then the regulation kicks in, the expression is suppressed, the composed surface is restored. The window between those two events is the micro-expression. It passes before most people consciously register it. But it is not nothing. The brain processes it, files something away, adjusts its running model of the person in front of you. The conscious mind may report nothing unusual. The amygdala may have already updated its assessment. The face has 43 muscles, though the number varies slightly depending on how the counting is done. They are organized differently from most skeletal muscles. anchored not to bone but to skin or to each other, capable of producing the subtle, rapid, precisely graded movements that facial expression requires. Some are voluntary in the sense that you can activate them deliberately. Others are not, or not reliably. The zygomaticus major pulls the corners of the mouth upward and outward, the primary muscle of a smile. It can be activated voluntarily, and it is constantly in the ordinary social production of pleasant expression. But a genuine smile, what Duchenne de Boulogne described in 1862, and what has since been called a Duchenne smile, also involves the orbicularis oculi, the ring of muscle surrounding the eye socket that produces the characteristic crinkling at the outer corners. The orbicularis oculi is largely involuntary. Most people cannot contract it on demand. This is the biological basis of the distinction between a real smile and a posed one. Not the presence of the expression, but the presence of the involuntary component, the muscle that the social brain cannot easily fake. When a genuine emotion arises, fear, contempt, surprise, disgust, sadness, the primary categories Ekman identified as cross-culturally consistent in their muscular signatures. It begins in the subcortical circuits. The amygdala activates. The hypothalamus responds. The facial nerve, the seventh cranial nerve, branching across the face in a wide, complex distribution, receives signals from brainstem motor nuclei that are directly connected to the limbic system. The face moves before the cortex has had time to decide what the face should do. This is the involuntary leakage, not a failure of regulation, just a timing difference. The subcortical response running faster than the cortical oversight that would, in a social context, moderate the expression. The genuine emotion animates the face for the window of milliseconds before regulation catches up. There is something slightly vertiginous about this, if you stay with it. Your face has been doing this your whole life. In every conversation where you felt something you weren't showing, in every moment of composed politeness over an underlying emotional state, the face was briefly, involuntarily telling the truth. For a duration too short for most observers to consciously register, but not too short for their brains. The people in those rooms absorbed the micro-expression without knowing they had. Their amygdalae updated. The running model of you, held in their social cognition, continuously revised, shifted by a fraction. And they probably couldn't have told you why they felt what they felt about you in that moment. The detection of micro-expressions without conscious awareness is the part that tends to sit uneasily. Studies using subliminal presentation, showing micro-expression, duration images of emotional faces too briefly for conscious recognition, then measuring physiological and behavioral responses, find that the brain responds. Skin conductance changes, amygdala activity shifts. Subsequent behavior is influenced in ways that the participant cannot account for. You are being read by systems that don't report to consciousness, and you are reading others the same way. The brief image I want to offer and then release. Think of the face as a surface through which underground water occasionally rises. The geology below determines what comes up and for how long before the surface is restored. The underground is the subcortical emotional system. The surface is the presented expression. The micro-expression is the moment of rising. The geology doesn't stop because the surface looks still. Contempt is worth dwelling on briefly because it is the expression most associated with micro-expression, research in interpersonal contexts. It has a distinctive muscular signature, unilateral contraction of the levator labii superioris alaeque narsi, a muscle running from the nostril to the upper lip, producing a slight imetric curl on one side of the face only. John Gottman's research on couples found that the presence of contempt in conflict interactions was the single strongest predictor of relationship dissolution, more predictive than criticism, defensiveness, or stonewalling. What makes this biologically interesting is that contempt as an expression communicates something specific and different from anger or disgust. Anger is other-directed. You've done something I object to. Disgust is stimulus-directed. Something in the environment is aversive. Contempt carries a particular relational content, a hierarchical evaluation, a downward regard, a social distancing that operates differently from either, and it leaks, even when suppressed, even when the face is otherwise composed. The brief unilateral curl appears and disappears before the conversation has moved to its next sentence. The partner may not consciously register it. Something in them does. Ekman trained people to detect microexpressions deliberately, and found that with practice, detection rates improve significantly. The capacity is learnable, but what's interesting is that most people without training are not particularly good at conscious detection. Accuracy rates hover around 50 to 55% in many studies, barely above chance. And yet the subliminal processing is occurring at high rates regardless of conscious detection ability. The brain is catching what the eye doesn't consciously see. Running a parallel evaluation, updating the social model without surfacing the update as a thought. This means the channel between faces is running more information than either party is consciously aware of, constantly, in every room where people occupy the same space. A continuous bidirectional stream of involuntary expression, caught, processed, responded to, beneath the layer of the conversation that either person would describe if asked. The face leaks because it was never designed to be a pure communication channel. It was designed in the same evolutionary sense that any biological structure is designed to express internal states for the benefit of conspecifics who needed to read those states. The expression of fear tells others in the group that a threat may be present. The expression of disgust may signal contamination. The expression of submission may prevent conflict. The social value of readable faces is so high that the subcortical pathways connecting emotional circuits to facial motor output are fast, direct, and relatively resistant to voluntary override. The face is, in some sense, optimized for leakage, for telling the social world what the body is experiencing before the mind has had a chance to curate the message. What changes in modern social life is that we are around people, many of them for long periods, in contexts where that kind of leakage carries costs it didn't carry in the environments that shape the system. The face runs its ancient program in a conference room, in a negotiation, in a conversation where what leaks might be used in ways that a small social group would not have used it. The program doesn't adjust, it just runs. 40 milliseconds, there and gone, before the eye tracked it, before the mind registered anything, before you formed a conscious thought about the person in front of you, something passed across a face. The seventh cranial nerve fired. A muscle moved. The subcortical system expressed what the cortex hadn't yet decided to show, and in the brain of whoever was present, something received it. Not as a thought, not as a perception, just as a slight wordless update to a model that was already running. The conversation continued. Both parties unaware. A verdict had arrived before the deliberation. This is not unusual, it is almost the rule. What happens when that verdict is wrong, when the speed that makes the system efficient makes it also error-prone, is where the next chapter has to go, because the machinery makes mistakes, and the mistakes are not random. The system was not built for this many strangers. That's the part worth starting with. Not as an excess, not as a way of softening what comes next, but as a plain biological fact. The social evaluation circuitry that produces first impressions was shaped in environments where the number of unfamiliar faces encountered in a lifetime was small, where most of the people you saw were people you already knew, whose faces had been processed thousands of times, whose emotional expressions had been read in dozens of different contexts, whose behavior had provided years of calibration data. In that environment, fast social judgment was not just efficient, it was accurate, or accurate enough, because the system was working with faces it had extensive prior exposure to, and misreading them carried immediate social consequences that provided rapid feedback. Now the system runs in a city, in a subway car, on a screen, processing faces it has never seen before, in context stripped of the surrounding social information that would have originally accompanied a new encounter, at a rate of social exposure that has no evolutionary precedent. The speed remains, the accuracy doesn't. There is a concept in signal detection theory called the criterion, the threshold at which a system decides a signal is present rather than absent. Set the criterion low, and the system is sensitive. It catches most real signals, but also generates many false positives. Set it high, and the system is conservative. It misses some real signals, but rarely responds to noise. The amygdala's criterion for threat in a face is set low. This made sense in the environment that shaped it. Missing a genuine threat, a hostile stranger, a predator, a member of a competing group, carried survival costs that false positives did not. The cost of treating a safe face as threatening was social friction. The cost of treating a threatening face as safe could be death. Under those conditions, a low criterion is not a bias in the pejorative sense. It is adaptive calibration. In modern social life, the asymmetry has shifted. False positives carry costs that the original environment did not impose. Damaged professional relationships, failed social connections, decisions made on the basis of threat signals that had no real threat behind them. But the criterion hasn't moved. The system is still set for the environment it came from. The amygdala responds to physical features that correlate statistically with threat expressions, even when those features are neutral. Faces with lower brows, more prominent brow ridges, downturned mouths, or darker pigmentation in certain lighting conditions can activate the amygdala's alerting response without any emotional expression being present. The face is doing nothing. The system responds to its geometry. This is what researchers call overgeneralization, the amygdala extending its response to threat-associated features beyond the specific stimuli that genuinely warrant a response. Think of it as the shadow of a calibration. The system learned that certain configurations of features correlate with threatening expressions, and now responds to those configurations even in their neutral form. The person being evaluated is expressionless. The amygdala has already filed a report, and the prefrontal cortex receiving that report will construct a conscious impression, a feeling about the person, a sense of unease or wariness, without having any access to the fact that the feeling originated in a pattern match to facial geometry rather than in anything the person did or expressed. The verdict arrives dressed as perception. Here is the dissociation that tends to be difficult to sit with comfortably. Confidence in a social judgment and accuracy of a social judgment are, in the research, essentially uncorrelated. The felt certainty of a first impression, that immediate, solid, seemingly obvious sense that you know something about a person, carries no reliable information about whether the impression is correct. Nalini Ambadi's work on thin slices, the idea that brief exposures to behavioral samples can support accurate personality judgments in some domains, showed that accuracy is possible from small amounts of information. But accuracy in those studies depended heavily on the domain being judged and the behavioral channel being used. For genuine personality traits expressed in behavior over time, thin slices can be informative. For trustworthiness, moral character, intelligence, or threat potential, read from a static face in a fraction of a second, the accuracy drops considerably and the confidence does not drop with it. You can feel certain about something the data doesn't support. The certainty is a property of the system, not of the judgment. The other race effect, introduced earlier in the context of the fusiform face area, produces a specific pattern of error worth tracing carefully. Because own race faces are processed with greater perceptual fluency, more efficiently, with more robust individuation, the brain assigns them a kind of implicit credibility that the processing itself doesn't warrant. Fluency feels like accuracy. When a face is easy to process, the brain interprets that ease as a signal that the representation is good, that the information is reliable, that the judgment derived from it is sound. For other race faces, processed less fluently, the reverse applies. The difficulty of processing is interpreted not as a perceptual limitation, but as a property of the face, as ambiguity, as opacity, as something that warrants continued vigilance. The processing difficulty produces unease. The unease is attributed to the person. This is not a deliberate misattribution. It is the brain doing what it always does, treating the quality of a cognitive process as information about the object of that process. It works reasonably well when the fluency differences are caused by genuine differences in familiarity or clarity. It produces systematic error when the fluency differences are caused by the perceiver's own perceptual history. There are mistakes the system makes that follow predictable patterns. Faces that are geometrically similar to expressions of fear or anger, even when expressionless, are rated as less trustworthy, more threatening, more likely to have committed crimes in mock jury studies. Faces with features associated with youth, larger eyes relative to face size, smaller nose, softer jawline, are rated as more trustworthy and warmer. Faces with features associated with dominance, stronger brow ridge, narrower eyes, are rated as less warm, regardless of their actual expression. None of these are conscious decisions. They arise automatically from a system that built its models of trustworthiness and threat from whatever input it received during development, and that now applies those models to every new face without recalibrating for context. The models are not random, they are not arbitrary, but they are wrong in ways that are systematic enough to be studied and mapped, which means they are wrong in ways that affect specific groups of people, in specific directions, with consequences that extend well beyond a momentary impression. The prefrontal cortex has the capacity to override the amygdala's initial response, to receive the threat signal, evaluate it against contextual information, and modulate the behavioral output. This regulatory capacity is real, and it is part of why explicit awareness of bias, while insufficient on its own, is not irrelevant either. But the override is effortful. It requires cognitive resources. It is less effective when those resources are depleted by stress, by sleep loss, by cognitive load, by the simple fatigue of a long day, and it operates on the conscious layer of social evaluation, while many of the consequential judgments, in hiring decisions, in split-second interactions, in the unconscious behavioral signals that influence how warmly one person treats another, operate below the layer that explicit awareness can easily reach. Knowing about a bias and not having the bias are different states. The knowing helps imperfectly sometimes under the right conditions. The mistakes the system makes are not distributed randomly across the people it evaluates. They follow the contours of the Ingroup/Outgroup gradient, the patterns of perceptual fluency and disfluency, The geometry of features the amygdala learned to associate with threat in a specific developmental environment, which means that the people most likely to receive an inaccurate negative verdict from a fast social judgment are the people whose faces the evaluating brain has the least experience processing, or whose faces share features with the geometric patterns the amygdala learned to flag. This is not a comfortable conclusion. It also isn't, strictly speaking, a surprising one. It follows directly from the biology described across the preceding chapters. The same system that produces social cohesion, that allows trust to form and cooperation to emerge, that reads a microexpression in 40 milliseconds and updates a social model before awareness arrives. That system makes errors, specific, predictable, consequential errors, and it makes them with complete confidence. The fragmented thoughts across this chapter have been aligning towards something that doesn't resolve cleanly. The machinery is old, the environment is new, the errors are not malfunctions, they are the outputs of optimization for a context that no longer exists, running in a context it was never tested in. The confidence that accompanies the errors is not arrogance. It is a property of a system that never evolved a mechanism for flagging its own contextual mismatch. The brain doesn't know when it's outside its design parameters, it just continues to evaluate, and somewhere in the knowing of all this, in the quiet accumulation of what these chapters have been laying down, there is something that functions not as a solution but as a kind of opening, a gap between the verdict and the trust placed in it. Small but present, the machinery runs. The gap is where something else can happen. The brain doesn't stop processing other people when the day ends. What happens to all of this, the gradients, the misfires, the amygdala reports, the cortisol residue, when the body finally goes still and the eyes close, is its own quiet biology. And it is stranger and more purposeful than simple forgetting. The body has been keeping score all day, not deliberately, not in any way that involved a decision, but across every social encounter, every face the amygdala flagged, every cortisol increment, every microexpression caught and processed beneath awareness, every gradient activation in the medial prefrontal cortex as the brain sorted familiar from unfamiliar, safe from uncertain, something was accumulating. A day's worth of social information still partially unprocessed, sitting in a kind of biological holding state as the evening arrived and the light changed and the body began its long, unhurried shift toward rest. Sleep is often described as a pause, a gap in the day, a period of absence. It is almost the opposite of that. The transition into sleep is not a single event. It is a cascade, a slow withdrawal of certain neurochemical systems, an equally slow ascent of others, a progressive shift in the electrical activity of the cortex from the fast, irregular, high-frequency patterns of alert wakefulness towards something slower, deeper, more synchronized. The norepinephrine systems that have been maintaining vigilance across the waking hours, keeping the amygdala primed, keeping the salience filters tuned, begin to quiet. Serotonin levels drop. The locus coeruleus, a small cluster of neurons in the brainstem that is the brain's primary source of norepinephrine, reduces its firing rate. The watching begins to stop, and in that quieting something becomes possible that wasn't possible during the day. Think of the emotional charge on a social memory as something like static on a surface, the kind that makes things stick to each other in ways they wouldn't otherwise. During waking, norepinephrine keeps the charge active, keeps emotionally salient memories, the difficult conversation, the stranger whose face triggered the amygdala, the moment of social uncertainty that cortisol accompanied, slightly elevated, slightly live, slightly more available to conscious retrieval than neutral memories. During REM sleep, the norepinephrine system goes quiet in a way it does at no other point in the 24-hour cycle. the locus coeruleus essentially ceases firing, and in that low norepinephrine environment, the brain replays emotionally salient memories, including social ones, in a neurochemical context that is fundamentally different from the one in which they were originally encoded. Matthew Walker's research on sleep and emotional memory has described this as overnight therapy. The memory is reprocessed, but the stress response that accompanied it is not. The content is retained. The charge is reduced. The memory of the difficult encounter survives into the morning. The visceral quality of it, the cortisol signature, the amygdala activation, the felt unease, is often diminished. You wake knowing what happened. You don't always wake feeling it the same way. The mechanism is worth tracing slowly because it is stranger and more specific than the broad idea of sleep processing emotions tends to suggest. REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, is characterized by a paradoxical pattern of brain activity. The cortex is highly active, producing electrical patterns not unlike waking, while the body is in a state of profound motor inhibition. The eyes move. The brain runs something that, in its metabolic demands, resembles wakefulness. But the neurochemical environment is entirely different. Acetylcholine is elevated. Norepinephrine and serotonin are suppressed. This neurochemical combination, high acetylcholine, low norepinephrine, creates conditions that appear uniquely suited to the reprocessing of emotional memories. Acetylcholine facilitates the kind of associative, loosely connected neural activity characteristic of REM. The reason REM stage mental content tends to be bizarre and associative, pulling together elements from different times and contexts in combinations that waking logic would not permit. Norepinephrine suppression removes the stress signal that would otherwise accompany the retrieval of difficult memories. The brain revisits the social encounters of the day in a state where it can hold them without the full physiological weight they carried when they first occurred. Slow-wave sleep, the deep, non-REM stages dominated by large synchronized oscillations called slow wave, does different work. During slow-wave sleep, the hippocampus replays the day's experiences in compressed rapid sequences that the cortex appears to listen to, gradually integrating the new information into existing knowledge structures. This hippocampal to cortical transfer is thought to be a primary mechanism of memory consolidation, the slow transformation of recent experience into long-term knowledge, from the hippocampus's temporary storage into the distributed cortical networks where stable memory lives. For social memories, the inferences made about specific people, the updates to the mental models held for individuals, the new information received about outgroup members that might begin to soften the amygdala's gradient. This overnight transfer matters. The brain is not just preserving what it learned today, it is integrating it, connecting it to everything it already knows, and in doing so subtly revising the models that tomorrow's social judgments will be made from. The person you'll meet tomorrow will be evaluated by a brain that spent tonight quietly reworking what it learned today. There is a specific finding that tends to be underappreciated in the sleep and emotion literature. Sleep does not consolidate all emotional memories equally. It preferentially consolidates emotionally salient ones, the encounters that carried the most effective charge, that activated the amygdala most strongly, that were accompanied by the largest cortisol responses. The neural tagging of emotional salience during waking, partly an amygdala function, partly a norepinephrine function, appears to flag certain memories for preferential overnight processing, which means the social experiences that felt most significant during the day receive the most careful overnight attention. The stranger whose face triggered something, the conversation that left a residue in the body, the moment of social uncertainty that didn't resolve cleanly before the evening came. These are the memories the sleeping brain returns to, works over, transforms. And the transformation is not random. It is shaped by the existing neural architecture, by the in-group, outgroup gradients, by the implicit memory systems that have been accumulating their records across a lifetime. The overnight revision doesn't occur in a neutral space. It occurs in a brain with a history, and the history shapes what the revision produces. What this means for the social judgments formed during the day is something worth sitting with. The verdict the amygdala delivered at 11 in the morning, the quick assessment of a stranger's face, confident and immediate and largely below awareness, is not the final version. By morning, the memory has been through REM sleep's norepinephrine-free reprocessing, through slow-wave sleep's hippocampal replay, through the consolidation mechanisms that integrate new social information with existing knowledge. The morning version of the judgment is not identical to the one that formed during the encounter. It may be softer, it may be more contextualized. The emotional charge may have reduced without the content disappearing. The brain may have connected the new face to other memories, other contexts, other people, and in doing so slightly complicated the simple verdict that arrived so quickly during the day. Sleep doesn't correct misjudgment automatically. It doesn't reverse the amygdala's biases or undo the effects of perceptual disfluency. But it provides something, a second pass, a reprocessing in a different neurochemical environment, a quiet revision that the waking mind never witnesses but wakes to find already done. There is something almost tender about that, if you let it settle. The brain, in the hours you are least aware of it, doing careful work on the social encounters of the day, not dramatizing them, not resolving them into neat conclusions, just holding them in the low norepinephrine quiet of REM sleep, letting the associative activity of acetylcholine-rich dreaming move them gently against other memories, other feelings, other ways of understanding the people the day delivered. The amygdala is quieter now than it has been all day. The cortisol is near its low point in the diurnal rhythm. The locus coeruleus has reduced its firing to nearly nothing. The vigilance that ran without stopping from the first moment of the cortisol awakening response this morning is finally easing. The sorting continues. But it happens now in a brain that has stopped watching. Somewhere in the hippocampus, the compressed replay of today's social experiences is running. Fast, sequential, reaching toward the cortical networks that will receive and integrate what it sends. The face of the stranger on the street. The colleague whose microexpression lasted 40 milliseconds before composure returned. The voice that caused the shoulders to drop slightly without the mind knowing why. The moment of warmth that released a small pulse of oxytocin and left a residue the chemistry couldn't carry forward, but the nervous system filed somewhere quieter. All of it, moving through the architecture of sleep, being revised, softened, connected, transformed. You're not aware of any of it. The most important social processing of your day is happening right now, in the dark, without your participation, in a brain that has finally stopped needing to evaluate anyone. The biological work of sleep is not gentle in the way rest is gentle. It is active, metabolically expensive, neurochemically complex, structurally significant in ways that a single night's disruption makes measurable. The glymphatic system clears waste products from the brain's extracellular space during sleep, including the metabolic byproducts of a day's intense neural activity. The immune system shifts into a different mode of activity. Growth hormone pulses from the pituitary in the early slow-wave stages, initiating repair processes across multiple tissue types. The body is doing many things at once, most of them invisible, all of them purposeful, none of them requiring your awareness to proceed. The social brain is just one of the systems running its overnight maintenance, reprocessing what the day deposited, filing what needs filing, softening what can be softened, carrying forward what matters, and the version of you that wakes with whatever impressions remain of yesterday's strangers, whatever residue of the day's social encounters has survived the night's revision, is the product of all of this, of the quiet, effortful, unseen work of a brain that never quite stops thinking about other people, even when you've finally stopped asking it to. There is a moment, just before sleep fully arrives, when something changes in the quality of awareness itself. The prefrontal cortex begins its descent. The amygdala's tone softens further. The body is still, but the stillness has a different quality than it did an hour ago, less like held alertness and more like something genuinely releasing. That threshold, and what the biology of it looks like from the inside, is where this finally comes to rest. Something is different now, not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself, but the quality of your awareness has shifted somewhere in the last few minutes in a direction that has no clean name. The room feels the same. Your body is the same temperature it was, and yet something has loosened. Some background tension you weren't aware of carrying has reduced by a fraction, and the reduction is perceptible only because it's happening, not because you were ever aware of the tension itself. This is what the threshold feels like from the inside. The prefrontal cortex doesn't go dark all at once. It steps down. Gradually, region by region, in a sequence that follows the relative metabolic demands of different areas and their connectivity to the arousal system that have been sustaining them across the day. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the region most associated with deliberate reasoning, with working memory, with the kind of effortful evaluation that explicit social judgment requires, begins to reduce its activity first. This is why thoughts at this hour feel different, less sequential, less willing to hold their shape. A thought arrives. It doesn't finish. Another thought begins somewhere adjacent to it, not quite connected, not quite separate. The mind that has been running social evaluations all day, building models of strangers, updating assessments, flagging faces, constructing justifications for feelings that arrived before the thinking did, that mind is stepping back from its own machinery. Not gone, just dimming. The amygdala's tone drops too, not immediately and not entirely, but measurably. The tonic firing rate of amygdala neurons decreases as sleep pressure increases and the arousal systems begin their withdrawal. The alerting signal, which has been running at some level since the cortisol awakening response of this morning, which has been flagging faces and processing social uncertainty and maintaining the low hum of vigilance that a day among other people requires, begins to quiet. There is no face in front of you now, the amygdala receiving no new social input, with norepinephrine beginning its overnight withdrawal, settles toward a resting state it rarely reaches during the day. The threat criterion is still there. The circuit is intact, but the tone, the background readiness, the hair-trigger quality of a system primed for fast social evaluation is softening. You are, for the first time in hours, not being watched, and the part of your brain that watches back is noticing. The default mode network, a set of regions including the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate, the angular gyrus, is active during waking rest and during certain kinds of self-referential thought. It has been involved throughout the day in mentalizing, in the simulation of other minds, in the construction of social narratives, in the continuous background process of thinking about people who are not present. At the threshold of sleep, the default mode network's activity becomes less coherent. The regions that constitute it begin to decouple slightly. Their synchronized activity, which underlies the network's function, becomes less precise. The social simulations it was running, the replayed conversations, The anticipated interactions, the mental models of people encountered today begin to fragment, not disappear, fragment. They become less sequential, less narrative. The person from this morning loses the thread of the story you were unconsciously building around them. The face that triggered something in the amygdala becomes less insistent, less tethered to the feeling that accompanied it. The social world is releasing its hold, gradually, without asking permission. Alpha waves. The brain's electrical activity has been shifting. During alert wakefulness, the EEG shows fast, low-amplitude beta waves. The electrical signature of a cortex actively processing, actively evaluating, actively maintaining the vigilance that the day required. As wakefulness fades, beta gives way to alpha, slower, larger waves between 8 and 12 Hz, most prominent over the occipital regions at the back of the skull. Alpha is not sleep, it is the anteroom, the electrical signature of relaxed wakefulness, of a cortex that has reduced its active processing without quite releasing it. Eyes closed, the visual system quieting, the alertness present but no longer directed anywhere specific. This is where you are, roughly. Somewhere in the transition between the directed vigilance of the day and the first stage of sleep, stage 1, N1, the hypnagogic threshold, where the brain is doing something that is neither waking nor sleep and has features of both. The hypnagogic state has its own biology. Brief involuntary hallucinations, hypnagogic imagery, arise from the same loosening of cortical control that fragments the default mode network's narratives. A face appears without context. A voice says something that makes no particular sense. A feeling of motion or of falling that resolves without consequence. These are not signals. They are the noise of a system powering down unevenly. Some regions releasing their grip before others, the visual and auditory cortices producing content in the absence of the top-down regulation that normally constrains perception to the external world. The social brain contributes to this too. The faces that appear at the hypnagogic threshold are often faces, real faces, remembered faces, or composite faces assembled from the fusiform area's accumulated models. The day's social residue rising briefly into awareness before the architecture of sleep closes over it. Some of those faces are strangers. Some are people you haven't thought of consciously in years. The nervous system is still processing. It just isn't pretending to be organized about it anymore. Muscle tone is dropping. The skeletal muscles, which have been maintaining postural readiness all day, which have carried the subtle tension that accompanies social vigilance, the slight tightening around the eyes and jaw and shoulders that comes with sustained monitoring of other people, are releasing. The reticular activating system's influence over motor tone is reducing. The body is becoming heavier in the particular way that has no equivalent in waking rest. There is a weight to this, specific, physical. If you notice it now, the heaviness of the arms, the way the jaw has loosened, the particular quality of the breath which has slowed without any deliberate instruction to slow, you are noticing the biology of social vigilance releasing from the muscles that have been carrying it. The body held it all day without telling you. It's setting it down now. Somewhere around stage 1 sleep, the brain produces theta waves slower than alpha, between 4 and 8 Hz, and the first sleep spindles begin to appear in stage 2. Brief bursts of oscillatory activity generated by the thalamus, lasting half a second to 2 seconds, appearing across the scalp in patterns that look in an EEG like small tight spirals. Sleep spindles are thought to be involved in the gating of sensory input, the thalamus actively suppressing incoming signals so that the sleeping brain is not disturbed by the environment it's releasing. The spindles are the brain closing its doors, not permanently, softly, with the particular biological courtesy of a system that knows it needs to be available again in a few hours, and so doesn't close entirely. Just filters, just reduces the gain on the incoming signal, just makes the world a little quieter than it was. What stays when the alertness leaves? The question the chapter began with, and the answer is not simple. The implicit social memories stay, encoded in synaptic weights that don't require sleep to maintain, distributed across the amygdala and insula and orbitofrontal cortex in a form that neither sleep nor waking will erase. The Ingroup gradient stays, its calibration unchanged by a single night. The Fusiform face area's preferences stay, shaped by decades of exposure, not moved by hours of rest. What changes is the charge. The emotional load carried by today's specific social encounters, the cortisol residue, the amygdala's raised alerting tone, the particular felt sense of unresolved social moments, this is what sleep metabolizes. This is what the low norepinephrine environment of REM will process in the hours ahead. What the slow-wave hippocampal replay will integrate. What the glymphatic system will help clear in the metabolic sense. The structure stays, the charge softens, and in the morning the same brain that evaluated strangers all day will do it again, but from a slightly different position than it held last night. Slightly rested, slightly less loaded with the specific weight of yesterday's encounters. The gradient intact, the circuit ready, the amygdala calibrated as it always was, but the charge on today's faces, that will have moved, like sediment settling in still water. And this is the one image worth offering here, held briefly. The disturbance of the day's social encounters is beginning to settle, not disappearing, settling. The particles that were suspended in the turbulence of waking life, held aloft by the norepinephrine and cortisol, and sustained neural activity of a day spent evaluating other people, are slowly finding the bottom. The water is becoming clearer, not because anything was resolved, because the system that kept everything suspended has finally at this hour begun to rest. If you've been here before, in this particular quiet at this particular hour, with a biology program playing softly in the background while the day's residue begins to settle, then you already know what this channel is. You know what it's trying to do, which is not to explain you to yourself, but to walk alongside the biology that's already happening, and name it gently enough that the naming doesn't disturb the process. If this is your first time here, and you found yourself somewhere unexpected, halfway through a chapter about oxytocin or microexpressions or the amygdala's ancient criterion, then something in the format suited you, and that's reason enough to come back. The like button, if you used it, is already a kind of small record of that. The subscribe button is just a way of making the return easier. The members who keep this space alive, who support the Sleepy Biologist through membership, through super thanks, through the small acts of ongoing attention that make long-form work like this possible, are part of why this particular episode exists in the form it does. Unhurried, uncompressed, long enough to actually work. There's no announcement here, just gratitude, quiet and genuine, for anyone who has stayed this long. The prefrontal cortex is dimmer now than it was at the start of this chapter. The amygdala is quieter. The default mode network's social simulations have lost their edges, become less sequential, drifted away from narrative towards something looser and more associative. Something that no longer quite holds the shape of today's strangers, today's faces, today's verdicts. The theta waves are present. The sleep spindles are beginning, the thalamus is closing its doors gently one signal at a time. The body that carried the social brain through a day of evaluation, that held the vigilance in its muscles and the cortisol in its bloodstream and the implicit records of a lifetime of faces in its synaptic weights, That body is very heavy now, not uncomfortably, just the particular weight of a nervous system that has, for this moment, stopped watching. The half second before you knew you were looking, the circuit that started all of this is still there, intact, ready, calibrated exactly as it was, but it isn't looking at anything right now, neither are you.